The baby's cry was a tiny, feral thing, swallowed by the din of the pouring rain. It was the kind of storm that washed the color out of the world, turning Elijah's walk home from the late shift into a cold, gray trudge. He was about to pass the mouth of the alley when he heard it, a sound too sharp, too desperate to be a cat. His heart hammered a warning. Keep walking, old man. Nothing in that alley is for you. But his feet, heavy as they were, turned anyway. There, tucked behind an overflowing dumpster, sheltered by a single, sagging cardboard box, was a wicker basket. And inside, wrapped in a sodden pink blanket, was a baby. Her face was screwed up, red and furious, her tiny fists punching at the air. She couldn't have been more than a few hours old. Elijah's breath caught. He was a 55-year-old janitor, a man whose own life had been a series of quiet losses. His wife, Sarah, gone too young, the dream of children gone with her. He lived a life of simple routines, work, church, a silent apartment. He was a man who took up as little space as possible. And now this. He looked around. The alley was empty. The rain-soaked streets were deserted. It was just him, the storm, and this abandoned child. Every sensible bone in his body told him to call the police, to hand this problem over to the proper authorities. But as he looked down at her, at the sheer, defiant will in that tiny, screaming body, something shifted inside him. It was a feeling deeper than sense, older than fear. A pull, a recognition. He couldn't leave her. With hands that trembled not from the cold, but from the enormity of the moment, he gathered the basket into his arms. He unzipped his worn janitor's jacket, tucked the blanket-wrapped bundle inside against his chest, and turned his back on the alley. The first night was pure, unadulterated terror. He laid her on his bed, a tiny island in the center of his faded quilt. He had nothing. No formula, no diapers, no clue. He fed her warm milk from a dropper he found in his first aid kit, his large, work-roughened hands impossibly gentle. He fashioned a diaper from a clean dish towel and safety pins. She finally slept, her breath a soft puff against his neck as he held her, too afraid to put her down, too awed to sleep himself. He named her Grace, because her survival felt like one, and because finding her felt like a gift he had done nothing to deserve. The world told him he was a fool, a black man his age with no wife, no money. They'd take her away. The social worker who came after a nosy neighbor called was skeptical, her face a mask of bureaucratic doubt. "Mr. Jenkins, this is a highly irregular situation. Are you prepared for the financial burden, the emotional toll? A child needs stability." Elijah looked at Grace, who was sleeping in a drawer he'd lined with blankets, a perfect makeshift crib. He looked the social worker in the eye. "She has stability," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "She has me." He fought for her. He took parenting classes. He worked double shifts, his body aching to buy formula and second-hand clothes. His small apartment, once a place of silence, filled with the sounds of lullabies and baby giggles. He learned to braid hair, to tie ribbons, to understand the complex social hierarchies of little girls. He was her father. It was the hardest, most glorious thing he had ever been. Grace grew. She was a bright, curious child with a fierce love for books and a stubborn streak that mirrored his own. She called him Papa. He was her whole world. She knew her story, the one about the storm and the alley. He made it a fairy tale for her, a story of how they found each other. He never let her feel anything but chosen. When she was 18, a brilliant student with a full scholarship to study history, she came to him with a request. It was for a school project, she said, on genealogy and ancestry. "Papa," she said, her eyes, so dark and knowing, fixed on his, "I want to do one of those DNA tests to see, where I come from." A cold dread, one he had kept buried for 18 years, clenched in Elijah's stomach. He had always known this day might come. He had built their beautiful, fragile world on a foundation of love, but the truth of her abandonment was a fault line running beneath it. He swallowed his fear. He would not clip her wings. "Okay, baby," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "if that's what you want." They sent the test kit away. The wait was an agony. Elijah prayed. He prayed that the results would show nothing, that she would be his and only his forever. When the email arrived, Grace opened it at the kitchen table, the same table where he'd helped her with her spelling homework and consoled her over teenage heartbreaks. He watched her face, his heart a frantic drum in his chest. Her expression shifted from curiosity to confusion to utter, profound shock. She looked from the screen to him, her eyes wide, filling with tears. "Papa," she whispered, her voice breaking, it says I'm a match, a familial match." Elijah's world tilted. A match to who? Grace turned the laptop around. On the screen was a name he had never expected to see again. A name from a life he had left behind. A name that belonged to a brother he hadn't spoken to in 40 years. And below that, the relationship prediction. 99.9% probability. Grandfather. Elijah stumbled back, his hand flying to his mouth. The air left his lungs. The secret he had carried, the truth he had buried in that rain-soaked alley, crashed over him. Grace wasn't just an abandoned baby. She was his granddaughter. Her father was his son. The son he'd had with Sarah, the son who had fallen in with a bad crowd, the son he'd argued with, who had stormed out of his life and never come back. The son he had assumed was dead or in prison. The DNA test hadn't just shocked his world. It had rewritten it. The child he had raised as his own was his flesh and blood. The abandonment wasn't random cruelty. It was a final, devastating act from his own lost boy. The love he had poured into Grace for 18 years had been flowing back to his own lineage all along. He looked at his daughter, his granddaughter, her face a mirror of his Sarah, her eyes his own son's. The secret he had kept to protect her had now been revealed by her own blood. The circle was closed. The lost had been returned. And the love that had built their life together was now, suddenly, ancestral. It was no longer just a choice he had made in an alley. It was his destiny fulfilled. The kitchen clock ticked, each second a hammer blow in the profound silence. Grace stared at him, her face a canvas of shattered trust and bewildered love. "Papa," she whispered again, the word now a question mark hanging over their entire life together. Elijah's legs gave way. He sank into a chair, the weight of decades pressing down on him. He could feel the ghost of his son, Marcus. In the room, the bright-eyed boy who loved baseball, the angry teenager who slammed the door. The man he became, the one who could abandon his own child in a rain-soaked alley. "Marcus," Elijah finally said, the name a rusted hinge swinging open after 40 years. "Your father was my son." He told her everything then, the story he'd never told a soul, about Marcus's mother, Sarah, her death from a swift cancer that stole her before Elijah could even process the diagnosis. How he, a grief-stricken janitor, had tried to raise their boy alone. How Marcus, at 16, had started to change. The skipped classes, the new, hardened friends, the lies. The final, explosive fight when Elijah found drugs in his room. "You can't tell me what to do. You're just a nobody, a janitor," Marcus had screamed, his face a twisted mask of a boy Elijah no longer knew. "I'm your father," Elijah had roared back, his voice cracking with a pain so deep he thought it would kill him. "Not anymore." And he was gone. The police reports went cold. The years bled into one another, a gray expanse of work and loneliness. Elijah assumed he was dead, or worse, in a prison somewhere, lost to him forever. "And then, I found you," Elijah finished, his voice a raw whisper. He looked at Grace, at the living, breathing proof of his son's existence. "I didn't know. I swear to you, baby, I didn't know. I thought you were a stranger, a gift." Grace was crying silent tears, her shoulders shaking. "All this time, you knew who my father was. You knew and you never told me." "No, no, Grace, I didn't put it together until this moment. I hadn't thought of Marcus in years. I'd buried him. To think of him was too painful." He reached a trembling hand across the table. "The test, it says grandfather. That means Marcus. He's..." Alive, Grace finished, her voice hollow. My father is alive. The world outside their kitchen window seemed to hold its breath. The foundation of their life, the story of the storm in the alley, had been ripped away, revealing a more painful, complicated truth beneath. The fairy tale was gone. In its place was a harsh, human drama of generational pain, a lost son, and a secret that had shaped their every moment. "What do we do now, Papa?" Grace asked, her voice small, the confident young woman replaced by a lost little girl. Elijah looked at her, at the granddaughter he had raised as his daughter. The love hadn't changed. It had only deepened, becoming more complex, more rooted. He had spent 18 years building a world for her. He would not let this destroy it. "We find him," Elijah said, the decision solidifying his resolve. "We find your father, my son." The search was a journey into a past Elijah had tried to forget. Grace, with the digital savvy of her generation, took the lead. The DNA website led them to a second cousin, who pointed them to a half-sister Marcus had never known he had. The trail was a spiderweb of fractured families and missed connections. They learned that Marcus had been in and out of rehab, had done short stints in county jail for petty crimes. He had drifted from city to city, a ghost, just as Elijah had been before Grace. The last known address was a homeless shelter in a city 3 states away. Elijah didn't hesitate. He took a week of vacation from his job, a concept that still felt foreign, and they drove there in his old, reliable sedan. The shelter was a grim brick building, a world away from their warm, book-filled apartment. The director, a weary-looking man with kind eyes, listened to their story. "Marcus Jenkins," he said, checking a logbook. "Yeah, he was here, quiet guy, kept to himself. He left about 6 months ago. Got a job, I heard, as a janitor at the community college." The irony was a physical blow, a janitor like his father. They drove to the community college. It was a mirror image of the one where Elijah worked. They asked for Marcus Jenkins at the maintenance office. A man pointed towards the gymnasium. "He's in there, setting up for graduation." They walked into the vast, empty space. Banners hung from the rafters. Folding chairs were lined up in neat rows, and at the far end, pushing a wide broom, his back to them, was a man. He was tall like Elijah. His hair was streaked with gray. His shoulders were stooped with a familiar weariness. He turned, hearing their footsteps echo in the cavernous room. Time stopped. Elijah saw his son, not the angry boy who had left, but a man etched with the lines of a hard life. But in his eyes, Elijah saw Sarah. He saw the boy who had once built model airplanes at the kitchen table. Marcus froze. The broom handle clattered to the floor. His face went through a seismic shift, shock, disbelief, a flicker of the old anger, and then a dawning, terrified recognition. His eyes moved from Elijah's face to Grace's. He saw it, he saw Sarah in her, he saw himself. "Dad," the word was a choked whisper, torn from a place long sealed shut. And then his eyes, wide with a horror and a hope that couldn't coexist, settled on Grace. He looked at her, really looked at her, and Elijah saw the understanding break over him like a wave. He was looking at his daughter, the daughter he had left in an alley, a product of a life he was too lost and too ashamed to face. Grace took a step forward, her own tears flowing freely now. She didn't say anything. She just looked at him, her father, the ghost who had haunted the edges of her life. Marcus stumbled back, his hand flying to his mouth. "No, no," he moaned, collapsing into a folding chair as his legs gave out. I thought she'd be better off. I was nothing. I was poison." Elijah walked forward, his own heart breaking and healing all at once. He stood before his son, this man he had mourned for decades. "She wasn't better off," Elijah said, his voice thick with a love that had never, not for a single day, died. "She was loved." He put a hand on his son's shoulder. The touch was electric, bridging 40 years of silence. Marcus looked up at him, his face a river of regret and awe. Then he looked at Grace, the living proof of his most terrible mistake and his most incredible redemption. "I'm so sorry," he whispered, the words meant for both of them. "I'm so, so sorry." They were just three people in a silent, empty gym. A grandfather, a father, and a daughter. The storm that had separated them had finally, after 18 years, brought them home. The DNA test hadn't shattered their family. It had, against all odds, made it whole. The three of them left the gymnasium wrapped in a silence more profound than any they had ever known. It wasn't an empty silence, but a heavy, sacred one, filled with the echoes of 1,000 unsaid things. They ended up at a diner a few blocks away, a place of vinyl booths and weak coffee, a neutral ground for a family that was both brand new and achingly old. Marcus sat across from them, his hands wrapped around his mug, unable to meet their eyes for more than a second. He looked at the chipped formica tabletop as if the story of his life was written there. "It was a girl I met," he began, his voice a low, rusty scrape. "Just a kid like me. We were both lost. She got pregnant. She was scared. Her family shipped her off to some home for girls. I never saw her again. She sent me a letter, just one, after Grace was born." He finally risked a glance at his daughter, his eyes filled with a bottomless well of shame. "She said she couldn't do it. She was giving the baby up. She told me to forget any of it ever happened." A shuddering breath. "I was strung out, angry at the world, angry at you, Dad." He looked at Elijah now, the old wound raw again. "I thought you'd given up on me. I got the notification from the adoption agency. A date, a time to sign the final papers, to relinquish all rights." The words tasted like ash. "I went there. I saw the social worker carrying a basket out to a car. I saw a pink blanket and I just snapped. I followed the car. When she stopped for gas, I took you." He looked directly at Grace, his face a mask of torment. "I didn't have a plan. I had nothing. No money, no home, no hope. I was high and I was desperate, and after a few hours I sobered up and realized the monstrous thing I'd done. I was a kidnapper. I was worse than nothing. I was a danger to you, so I left you somewhere I knew you'd be found quickly, somewhere safe." He swallowed hard. "The alley behind our old church, I thought. I thought someone from the congregation would find you, would give you the life I never could." Elijah listened, his heart breaking and mending with every word. The puzzle pieces of that stormy night were finally clicking into a horrifying, heartbreaking picture. His son, lost and terrified, had committed an act of both theft and sacrifice. He had stolen his own daughter, only to abandon her out of a twisted, desperate love. "You went to the wrong alley, son," Elijah said, his voice gentle. "The church is on 5th Street. You left her on 7th, behind the Golden Dragon restaurant." Marcus stared, the mistake dawning on him with fresh horror. I was so messed up. I must have gotten the streets mixed up." The thought that his daughter had been minutes from a different, unknown fate was a new layer of agony. For Grace, the story was rewriting her origin yet again. She wasn't just abandoned. She was desperately, tragically wanted by a father too broken to care for her. The story shifted from one of cold rejection to one of fiery, catastrophic failure. "Why didn't you come back?" Elijah asked, the question that had haunted him for decades. "After I left her, I panicked. I ran, I hopped a train and just disappeared. I figured the police would be looking for me, for kidnapping. Every time I thought of coming back, the fear of prison, the shame. It was a wall I couldn't climb. It was easier to just be dead." The waitress came to refill their coffee, the normalcy of the act a stark contrast to the confession unfolding in the booth. When she left, the heavy silence returned. Grace finally spoke, her voice quiet but clear. "What's her name, my mother?" Marcus looked startled, as if he'd never considered Grace would want to know. "Rebecca," he said softly. "Rebecca Miller. I don't know what happened to her." Grace nodded, filing the name away in her heart, a new thread to possibly pull on someday. The conversation continued for hours, stretching through the afternoon. They didn't solve everything. The 40 years of absence couldn't be bridged in a single sitting. The pain was too deep, the wounds too old. But a foundation was laid. a fragile, painful, honest foundation. They drove back home the next day, the car filled with a different kind of quiet. Grace stared out the window, processing the tectonic shift in her identity. Elijah focused on the road, his mind replaying every moment of the last 18 years through this new, painful lens. In the weeks that followed, a new, cautious rhythm began. Marcus stayed in his city, but he and Grace started talking on the phone. The conversations were awkward at first, stilted and full of landmines. He asked about her life, her school, her dreams. She asked hesitant questions about his. He was sober now, he told her. Had been for 5 years. The job as a janitor was his way of trying to build something stable, to atone in some small way. Elijah spoke to his son, too. The conversations were slower, heavier, laden with the grief of lost time. They talked about Sarah. They talked about baseball. They carefully avoided the minefield of their last fight. One Sunday, a month later, Marcus came to visit. He stood nervously on the doorstep of the apartment he had stormed out of so long ago. Elijah opened the door. They looked at each other, two old men, their faces mirrors of a shared loss and a stubborn hope. "Come in, son," Elijah said. Marcus stepped over the threshold, and he didn't break. He wept. He wept for the boy he had been, for the man he had become, for the father he had lost and found. Grace watched from the kitchen doorway, her own eyes wet. She walked over and, after a moment's hesitation, put her arms around him. It was a stiff, uncertain hug, but it was a start. He was not the father who had raised her. That was Papa. He would never be. But he was a part of her story, a part of her blood, and he was trying. At night, the three of them sat at the same kitchen table where the DNA results had shattered their world. But now they were putting it back together, piece by painful piece. The picture that was emerging was not the one they had started with. It was messier. It was scarred. But it was real. It was theirs. The lost had been found, not just in a DNA test, but in a dusty gymnasium, in a vinyl diner booth, and now, in the warm, forgiving light of a kitchen they were learning slowly to share as a family. The Sunday dinners started as a promise, a fragile thread stretched between two cities. The first one was a quiet, stilted affair. Marcus brought a store-bought pie, his hands shaking slightly as he handed it to Grace. The conversation was a minefield of avoided topics, sticking to the safest of subjects. The weather, a movie they'd all seen, the traffic on the drive over. Elijah watched them, his heart a tangled knot of hope and sorrow. He saw the way Grace studied Marcus when he wasn't looking, searching his face for traces of herself. He saw the way Marcus's eyes would linger on a childhood photo of Grace on the bookshelf, a look of profound loss and wonder on his face. After that first dinner, as Marcus was leaving, he hesitated at the door. "Dad," he said, the word still unfamiliar on his tongue, I'd like to start contributing for Grace, for college." Elijah looked at his son. At the pride warring with shame in his eyes, he knew what it cost him to say that. "That's a good thing, son," he said softly. "That's a real good thing." The next Sunday, Marcus handed Grace a sealed envelope. Inside was a money order, a modest amount, but clearly a significant portion of his weekly pay. Grace looked from the money to her father's anxious face, and for the first time she didn't see the man who had abandoned her. She saw a man trying to build a bridge back, one painstaking brick at a time. "Thank you," she said, and she meant it. As the weeks turned into months, the dinners evolved. The silences became less heavy, the laughter more frequent, if still a little surprised at its own existence. Marcus started staying later, helping Elijah with small repairs around the apartment, fixing a leaky faucet, patching a hole in the drywall. It was physical work, a language they both understood better than words. One evening, while replacing a light fixture, Marcus spoke, his voice muffled as he focused on the wires. "I got my GED last year." Elijah, steadying the ladder, felt a surge of pride so sharp it brought tears to his eyes. That's wonderful, Marcus." "Thinking about taking a class at the community college, maybe bookkeeping or something." "You should," Elijah said, his voice thick. You always had a good head for numbers." It was the first acknowledgement of the son he'd once known, a tiny fragment of the past they could reclaim. Grace, meanwhile, was navigating her own complicated journey. She had found Rebecca Miller on social media. Her mother was a dental hygienist living in a suburb 2 states away, married with 2 young sons. Grace stared at the photos for a long time, a woman with a kind smile, a life built after the storm. She composed a dozen messages, deleting everyone. What could she say? "Hi, I'm the daughter you gave up for adoption, who was then kidnapped by my biological father and raised by my grandfather." The truth was a grenade. She decided for now to just watch. To know she was out there, it was enough. The real turning point came the night Grace brought home her first college acceptance letter. It was from her top choice, a university with a renowned history program. She burst through the door, waving the letter, her face radiant. "Papa, I got in, I got in." Elijah swept her into a hug, laughing, his own eyes wet. "I never had a doubt, baby, not a single one." That Sunday, when Marcus arrived, Grace practically shoved the letter into his hands before he'd even taken his coat off. He read it slowly, his lips moving silently over the words. When he looked up, his eyes were shining. "History," he said, a slow smile spreading across his face. "You're going to be a historian." "It's what I've always wanted," Grace said, beaming. "I remember. I liked history too," Marcus said almost shyly. "The Romans, the pyramids, all that stuff." He looked at Elijah. "Dad used to take me to the library every Saturday." Elijah nodded, the memory a sweet ache. "You'd check out so many books you could barely carry them." For a moment, the three of them were suspended in a perfect, unbroken circle of shared joy and a reclaimed past. The ghost in the room wasn't one of pain anymore, but of possibility. Later that night, as Marcus was preparing to leave, he turned to Grace. "I'm so proud of you," he said, his voice earnest. "And I'm going to help. I'm going to make sure you can go." He didn't just mean the money. He meant he would be there, a part of her life, a father. The following week, Grace finally sent the message to Rebecca. It was simple, careful. "Hello, my name is Grace Jenkins. I believe you may be my biological mother. I was born on October 17th. If you're open to it, I would appreciate the chance to talk." The reply came a day later. "Grace, I've thought about you every day of my life. Yes, please, let's talk." The family that had been forged in a lie, tested by a DNA test, and rebuilt in a dusty gym and a vinyl diner booth, was still growing. It was messy, imperfect, and stitched together with forgiveness and grit. But as Elijah looked at his granddaughter, his daughter, and his lost son, now found, he knew that the greatest legacy wasn't in their blood, but in their choice to love each other through the wreckage. The story that began with an abandoned baby in an alley was still being written, and for the first time, all of the authors were finally together, turning the page. The first conversation with Rebecca was a hesitant three-way video call. Grace sat between Elijah and Marcus on the old sofa, the laptop balanced on the coffee table. When Rebecca's face appeared on the screen, a woman with Grace's same dark, expressive eyes and a nervous smile, the air in the room shifted. "Grace," Rebecca breathed, her voice trembling. "Oh, you're so beautiful." "Hi," Grace said, her own voice small. Elijah leaned forward. "I'm Elijah, Grace's grandfather." He paused, the complexity of the situation hanging in the digital space between them. "And this is Marcus." Rebecca's face tightened for a fraction of a second, a flash of old pain and anger. "Marcus." The name was an accusation. Marcus, who had been holding his breath, flinched. "Rebecca, I owe you an apology. That's 18 years too late. What I did was, there are no words." The story was told again, this time with a new listener. Rebecca listened, her face a canvas of emotions. The old hurt of being a scared teenager sent away, the shock of the kidnapping, the profound relief that Grace had been loved and cared for. "When they told me the baby was gone, that there had been an incident, I thought I would die," Rebecca whispered, her composure breaking. I was told it was a kidnapping, but there were no leads. I had to. I had to move on or drown. I'm so sorry, Marcus repeated, the words inadequate but necessary. After 2 hours, the call ended with a promise to talk again soon. Grace was emotionally exhausted, but a new piece of her soul had clicked into place. The following months were a masterclass in building a new, sprawling, complicated family. Rebecca and her husband, David, drove down to meet them. The meeting was awkward, filled with the polite caution of people navigating a minefield of past trauma. David, a kind and steady man, shook Elijah's hand firmly. "Thank you," he said simply, "for raising such an incredible young woman." Rebecca's 2 young sons, aged 8 and 10, stared at Grace with open curiosity. "Are you our sister?" the youngest asked. "Yes," Grace said, her heart swelling. "I am." Slowly, carefully, a new normal emerged. Grace spent a weekend with Rebecca's family, getting to know her half-brothers. Marcus continued his Sunday dinners, and sometimes Rebecca and her family would join. The table was crowded, loud, and alive. It was everything Elijah's quiet apartment had never been, and everything he hadn't known he was missing. One evening, while helping Elijah wash up after one of these chaotic dinners, Marcus spoke quietly. "I got into the bookkeeping program, Dad, at the college. Starts next semester." Elijah turned off the water, his hands dripping. He looked at his son, really looked at him. The hardness around his eyes had softened. The weight on his shoulders seemed a little lighter. "I'm proud of you, son," Elijah said, and this time the words carried no shadow of the past, only the bright, clear light of the present. The day came for Grace to leave for university. They all stood outside the apartment: Elijah, Marcus, Rebecca, David, and the 2 boys, a send-off committee for a journey that was, in so many ways, all of theirs. Grace hugged Rebecca and David, then her little brothers. She turned to Marcus. "Don't be a stranger," she said, pulling him into a tight hug. "I'll expect texts and help with my accounting homework." Marcus laughed, a real free sound that Elijah realized he hadn't heard in over 40 years. "I'll be here," he promised. Finally, Grace turned to Elijah. She buried her face in his chest, just as she had when she was a little girl. "I love you, Papa." He held her, breathing in the scent of her shampoo, memorizing the feel of her in his arms. "Go be brilliant, baby," he whispered, his voice cracking. "The world's been waiting for you." He watched the car drive away until it turned the corner and disappeared. The silence of the apartment waited for him, but it felt different now. It wasn't the silence of loneliness, but the quiet hum of a life fully lived, of a story still unfolding. Marcus clapped a hand on his shoulder. "She'll be back for Thanksgiving, Dad, and we'll bug her with video calls every day until then." Elijah looked at his son, then back at the empty street. The child he had found in a storm had brought the son back into his life, and in saving her, he had, against all odds, saved his son and found a family larger and more beautiful than he could have.